would never ask me here, how much do you make a year, right? I would never ask you. That's polite conversation, right? And yet here in the proxy statement, we get to see it right there.
Hello and welcome to Off the Books, where we surf the uncharted waters of accounting, finance, risk, and wherever else the waves take us. This episode is brought to you by Workiva, the one platform that unites financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk, plus GAAP taxonomy enthusiasts and XBRL aficionados. Workiva, it fills the gap in your heart. My name is Steve Soder, accounting enthusiast and Diet Coke aficionado. I'm looking forward to debating a great conversation, and I'm so happy to have you with us. I am also, as always, very happy to have Catherine Tsai joining us. Catherine, can you please tell everyone about yourself?
Sure, I'm not an accountant or Diet Coke aficionado, but I like venti soy chais and asking questions, so I'm very excited to ask questions of our guest today.
I can completely understand why. Today, we are talking to Michelle Leader, who runs the website footnoted.com, who has been digging into the juiciest parts of SEC filings since all the way back in 2003. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve and Catherine. I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Well, to get started, tell us a little bit about footnoted.com and maybe how did that all begin with in the first place?
Yeah, so, the site began, I feel like I'm a grandmother when it comes to financial blogging. This is not a Johnny-come-lately type of thing. I started in 2003, so we're coming up on the 20th anniversary, and it was when I wrote a book called Financial Fine Print: Uncovering a Company's True Value. I had been a business journalist previously, and as a business journalist, I thought that I knew a lot about investing, right? Because I was writing about this stuff all the time. And what I learned when I bought, a stock, it wasn't the first stock I bought, but one of the earlier stocks that I bought, was that I knew virtually nothing because I didn't actually read the SEC filing. Even though I was reading SEC filings for my reporting, it's kind of like, the carpenter who, needs to repair their house, the handyman who has a broken toilet and all these other things, right? So I was not reading the SEC filing for this particular company, which was Quest Communications. And after I lost a bunch of money on it, I went back and I was like, what if I had actually spent some of my time reading this? Would I have lost? And, at the time it was like $5,000, which, was a good amount of money to me at the time. And I went back and I was like, if I had spent like an hour or two reading the filings, reading the 10K, reading the Qs, I probably wouldn't have lost that $5,000. And, that was, probably would have been a good investment in my time, right? Like 2-3 hours reading the Ks, not losing $5,000. That was a good equation at that time.
That brings back some memories, Quest. Jeez.
Right.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I chuckled when you said you lost some money. Michelle, I apologize for that. That's not a laughing matter. I'm so sorry.
Okay. You know what? You learn. I tell my son all the time, you learn from your mistakes. He comes home with a 92 in math. It's okay. You can focus on what you got wrong and figure out how you do better the next time.
So you mentioned your book, you mentioned the website. Is there also a newsletter related to Footnoted too?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things. One of the things that I focus on is the Friday night dump. And the Friday night dump is a period that starts after 4 p.m. on Friday afternoons. So later today, this is a Friday. We're taping this on a Friday. Come 4 p.m. Eastern, markets close, as we all know, but the SEC remains open for another 90 minutes. And that's when companies tend to take out the trash. And so we really pay close attention to that. Perhaps some companies, some of the folks who are listening to this have, you see things filed at, the SEC actually closes at 5:30. They actually have a tenth of a second clock. So I've seen sometimes companies filing at 5:30, 57 type of thing. So it's really like they really rush it in right before the SEC closes, hoping that, most people are more focused on what they're doing for the weekend. As opposed to, looking at, SEC filings, 8Ks in particular, but really all filings. There's a lot of dumping that goes on a Friday afternoon.
Interesting.
I actually saw your most recent, I got it through LinkedIn, and would actually recommend to our audience to definitely subscribe to that on LinkedIn. It was about three-card Monte. And it was
Yeah.
so funny, actually, because I've played that game with auditors before. I might not want to get into that here in the podcast, but it was really, really interesting that you had brought that up with the context of, these kind of juicy bits of maybe bad news that companies are trying to sweep under the rug late on a Friday night.
Every now and then we'll find something that is, positive. But I would say that, the negative definitely outweighs the positive by far, by, a strong ratio. And, again, this is not like, I just want to make clear, this is not like, oh my God, this is such negative information that I need to sell the stock immediately, or I need to some people would short the stock immediately. There are short sellers who also subscribe to the product. This is more of a, it's an indication of a potential problem. A lot of times what I like to think of it as is here in California in particular, it's very common to go to the dermatologist once a year for an annual skin check to make sure that little mole that you have that you're looking at is not actually cancer, right?
Sure.
Because you want to deal with it before it becomes a real problem.
Well, Michelle, I definitely want to ask you more about what you found in the filings, but we're going to take a quick commercial break and we'll be right back.
This episode of Off the Books is brought to you by Workiva. When I listen to Off the Books, I like to treat myself to a side dish of Cheetos. That's right, the snack food you know and love that leaves behind an orange film on your fingers and whatever your Cheetos fingers grab. It's like an audit trail of where your Cheeto hands have been. What if there was a virtual Cheetos for finance and accounting professionals that left an audit trail of who's been touching your data, who's been changing it, and when? Enter Workiva. It's the platform that simplifies complex work with built-in features like an audit trail. Your team can build spreadsheets, reports, and presentations in the Workiva platform. When anyone makes a change, the Workiva platform tracks who made that change, what changes were made, and the date and time of the change. It's like its own virtual trail of orange pixie dust, only much, much cleaner. See the many other benefits of using Workiva at workiva.com/podcast. That's WORKIVA.com/podcast.
All right, and we are back talking to Michelle Leader of footnoted.com. Michelle, I'm certain you looked at a lot of proxy stuff during this most recently concluded proxy season. Lots of good details in there, it seems like. What did you find this year?
It's always so much fun to read the proxies. When I do a presentation, I always joke around. I say proxies are the sexiest document in the SEC universe. You don't usually think of SEC and sexy at the same time. And sorry if this is NSFF or if that gets close to it, whatever. But it is really it has information, right? You would never ask me here, how much do you make a year, right? I would never ask you. That's polite conversation, right? Nobody asks that. Nobody asks what's in your wallet. Of course, there's external clues like what car you drive or the size of your house or whatever, but nobody really knows. And yet here in the proxy statement, we get to see it right there. How much does so-and-so make? And you get to see it for the top 5 executives and sometimes more executives. And so that's why I joke around that proxies are really, the sexiest document because it's giving you information that, maybe you could say it's prurient interest, whatever. But I think, if you're a shareholder in the company, it's important. I always like to look at the proxies because not only are you getting the compensation for the top 5 executives, you're also getting, consulting agreements, you're getting related party transactions, you're getting how much directors are compensated for. So there's a lot of really good information in there. And then, of course, the shareholder voting, what shareholders are proposing. So there's really a lot of things to like about reading proxies. And I found a lot of good stuff this proxy season. I think one of my favorites was the disclosure in DraftKings proxy statement about how they spent, and this was something I posted about on LinkedIn, they spent about $130,000 to take the CEO and his family to the Super Bowl, last year. That's a lot of money. I mean, I know in the greater scheme of things, is $130,000 going to bankrupt DraftKings? No, probably not. But the idea that like the company is paying for this is kind of, that's the detail that you find in a proxy that you probably would not find anywhere else. I can guarantee you DraftKings was not putting out a press release saying, hey, we spent $130,000 to take our CEO and his family to the Super Bowl.
Why would DraftKings disclose that? Does that mean it's material, or is it just something that they felt they needed to disclose?
I think it's probably, I don't know DraftKings financials intimately, but like, I think it would be hard to argue that it was material. So it's kind of like good news, bad news. It's interesting to see and, kind of like makes you like, the CEO really couldn't pay for his family to go to the Super Bowl. I mean, we pay for all sorts of things, right? You want to take your kids to Disney for the weekend. It's on you. Whatever you want to do, right? Like, and so it's kind of interesting when you see these sorts of things. And we saw a lot of them in the proxies this year. I mean, that was one that really jumped out at me, but there were plenty of others too.
One of the things that occurs to me, and I'm certainly not a securities attorney, but I have been part of those conversations before. So the CEO is one of the, named executive officers where that compensation disclosure that she had mentioned you can find in proxies, that is a required disclosure. And there's this behind the scenes conversation like, okay, could that have been construed as being part of the CEO's compensation? If it was and wasn't a business expense, okay, then yeah, this probably belongs on the proxy, even though at a dollar amount, for sure, it's not going to be material from an SEC reporting standpoint. And then there's that back and forth between the executive, the company, as well as the securities counsel, like, well, hey, we don't really want to disclose it, but we feel like we have to disclose it. And crap, if I knew that we were going to disclose it, I probably wouldn't have done the thing in the first place because it's a little bit embarrassing, What else did you come across this proxy season, Michelle?
I think there's all sorts of interesting things. I mean, like, Zoom recently, they just put out a proxy last week because I guess they're on a little bit of a different schedule. This is Zoom Communications. And they had an executive, a former Google executive, who spent 9 months working there. And before he was let go, he was, I think, named the president of Zoom. And he worked there for 9 months and he wound up with about $30 million for that 9-month stint. Which is, a lot of money for, I think most of us, if we were asked, hey, work 9 months, make $30 million, I think there's very few people who wouldn't take that deal. You see things like that, like, you see security costs. I mean, I look at like, Facebook. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg famously takes, $0 in salary, but he spends over $20 million on, security costs. So there's things like that, that you see, the security costs are really really interesting because they have been creeping up quite a bit lately. And, you've always seen this in the proxies. I mean, I remember one time a couple of years ago, maybe it was even longer, the CEO of Macy's at the time, Federated Department Stores. It was right around the time that Federated changed its name to Macy's. And there was a disclosure about how the CEO was driven around in an armored car with security guards. And I'm thinking, like, is someone really coming? Yeah, that seems like I don't know. I obviously, I don't know the threats that these folks face, and I don't want to make light of it because, perhaps there are legitimate security threats, right? I mean, I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg faces legitimate security threats, and he has a right to protect him and his family. But some of these do seem a little, kind of like over the top. I mean, I just can't imagine, why you need to be driven around in a, like a vehicle like, Biden, is driven around in when you're the CEO of Macy's.
How does that compare, though, to security costs for other big-time CEOs?
That's one of the largest I've seen, honestly. I mean, Amazon, Jeff Bezos spends a lot as well. I don't remember looking at that number this year, but in the past it's been, pretty hefty. I mean, look, these people do not live lives like you and me. They have multiple residences that they, and multiple conferences and, private jets and multiple, like entourages with them and everything like that. So, I mean, there is some expense to that.
Steve, do you disclose what your security costs are?
Well, as of yet, my security costs are limited to the golden doodle I have watching over me here at the house. We took that as a personal expense, though, so we don't plan to charge that back to Off the Books or to our sponsor. It's interesting on that thought about security, because I wonder if you were to talk to a member of the board, say, hey, what do you think about this? And I'm assuming that if you were a founder, let's say, Zuckerberg, for example, say, well, hey, you know what, it kind of is what it is. Like, what do you want me to do?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you can make a legitimate example. A legitimate argument, I should say. I think, someone like Zuckerberg is a unique individual in his position, and I'm sure he legitimately faces security risks. And he's got 2 young children, and, anyone who's a parent will know that they'll do anything to protect their kids, right? But it doesn't look good when you're laying off employees.
Well, Michelle, I know you mentioned that this year marks the 20th anniversary of footnoted.com. So over the years, what are some of the most surprising things that you found, or the sexiest disclosures you found?
One of my favorites actually is from Quest Communications, and it was a number of years ago, and they had hired a new CEO who had been living in had been living in San Francisco, relocated to where Quest was based in Denver. And as part of the disclosure, they disclosed that I think the stepdaughter was allowed to fly private between San Francisco and Denver to go to, back and forth to her school. And I remember thinking, like, this seems like kind of a crazy request, like a high school kid. I used to take the bus to high school, New York City Transit. It was quite glamorous. And, this kid gets to fly back and forth on a Gulfstream or whatever. I don't know, it was a Gulfstream, but like gets to fly back and forth on a private jet to go to high school. I mean, this is like probably 15 years ago. It was early on when I was, like maybe even earlier starting out. And so I wonder what that girl, like how do you get on a Southwest flight once you've gotten used to flying private in high school?
Slightly different experience.
Yeah, do you get like number C30 and like you're happy with that?
Well, and I'm connecting the dots here that clearly you've started paying more attention to Quest Communications, so you weren't fooled twice there.
Yeah, exactly.
The loss of your investment. Well,
yeah,
Michelle, one question that I have: what advice would you give to companies who may have to make a potentially embarrassing disclosure? And to me, it seems like, look, if you're doing something at the last possible minute on a Friday night, you're messaging subtly that you don't want a lot of people to see this. And I wonder about what's going on behind the scenes of that, outside counsel and public relations and other people. But I'm just wondering, if you find yourself in that position, what do you do? Any advice that you have, having looked at this for so many years?
I mean, I think just get, get it out there. Honesty is like, I went to Brandeis University, and like Louis Brandeis famously said, sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? It's get it out there. And, maybe don't try to make it seem like, dress it up as something that it isn't. So in one way, I salute the people at DraftKings. They were like, that had to be embarrassing to say that we paid for the CEO and his family's Super Bowl thing, but they actually got it out there and they said it.
Well, and it occurs to me, to that point about all the people that it takes to put together a proxy, it would seem like this is a governance opportunity because, again, to use the DraftKings example, I've got to believe that if the CEO understood that this was going to be disclosed, maybe they would have thought about, okay, well, does it become compensation if my family's there? And so if my family stays home or I pay for my family, then yeah, maybe I could argue that this is a legitimate business expense. You do wonder if the governance surrounding that could maybe inform whoever that executive is, so that whatever the thing is, a trip to the Super Bowl, private jet or whatever, if they understood the disclosure implications, then they could make more of an informed decision. Hey, would I really want this disclosed to my neighbors, right? Who next door could just, with a simple search on Edgar, actually pull up something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could certainly make that argument that, I don't know, again, because I'm not familiar with that side of the equation, right? I only see what's disclosed. But I would imagine that there's a lot of discussion that goes on in the background. And I could see how, it would be, beneficial if they knew that this was going to have to be disclosed, that maybe they would treat it differently. Maybe they would, buy their own tickets to the Super Bowl. I mean, $130,000 for the Super Bowl is a lot of money. Presumably, I don't know where he was flying from. The end point was LA. But like even, a cross-country flight and, parking and meals and, that's a pretty nice weekend. I don't spend $130,000 for the weekend, I gotta tell you.
Well, or an average weekend in the Soder house, I mean, it just sort of depends. I'm just kidding.
Do you roll that way, Steve?
Maybe. No, I don't. I certainly don't.
Catherine, you blow $130,000 on a weekend?
I am excited to try. Well, let's say you do have a really potentially embarrassing disclosure. When and how is the best place to disclose it? Do you wait for the proxy? Do you try to do an 8K as soon as possible? What do you think?
I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of embarrassing disclosure you have. I mean, we've seen a lot of like lately with, sort of coming out of the Me Too movement, executives suddenly being, let go, actually, and that reminds me of a pet peeve that I have. In all of these years of reading filings, companies will almost undoubtedly say that so-and-so, John Doe, Sally Katz, whatever her name is, whoever the person is, that there were no disputes when they left. So they wait until Friday after 4 p.m. to disclose it. And invariably, it's always like there were no disputes. And I'm like, do you leave a job that pays, a good salary, with really no disputes? So it's just like one of those things, like it's kind of like, couched in the language of saying that, the same thing with accounting firms, right? Someone's accounting firm is let go. Almost like, I would say 98% of the time, it's like there were no disputes, no arguments, no, there's 3 different disclosures, no material events, whatever. So I feel like honesty is always the best policy. And I realize that, it can be tricky because there is a active plaintiff's bar. And so, some of these companies are, obviously, working on their disclosures with that in mind. But yeah, I think that, honesty is always the best policy.
Well, Michelle, it has been a pleasure to talk to you. As we get ready to wrap up, we'll note that the website is footnoted.com. We all gave really brief bios of ourselves at the beginning of this episode, but what is a footnote that you would add to your bio if we could add a footnote to a podcast episode, that is?
My dog actually reads all the SEC filings for me. I am just an AI front.
Well, you're a very pleasant AI front, so you've got that going for you.
There you go.
Catherine, how about you?
Mine would be once worked at a tortilla factory, which convinced me to get my college degree and go into a different career instead. What's yours, Steve?
Well, after some discussion and intrigue recently, I will say that I do love Diet Coke. That is my drink of choice. However, a Coke Zero is acceptable from time to time. So that would be my footnote there.
Surprising footnote.
Well,
I don't
Michelle,
like Coke Zero at all.
Really? Like not even a bit, but you do like Diet Coke. Is that correct?
I do like Diet Coke, but and you know what I really love, like especially being here in Southern California, I love the Mexican Coke. And
yes.
It's easy to find here in Southern California. When I was back living in New York, like, I'd walk into these bodegas and I would ask for Mexican Coke, and I think that they thought I was looking for something else.
What's Mexican
Not soda.
Okay. Hey, I got a guy, but he's not in the store. Where you got to go out back to ask him. Oh, man. Well, Michelle, big thanks for joining us on the episode today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. Now on to the Friday night dump.
There you go.
Couple hours.
Well, thank you, dear listener, for surfing along with us. I'm Catherine Sy. That was Steve Soder, and this has been Off the Books presented by Workiva. Please subscribe, leave a review, tell your buddies if you liked the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave us a note in the comments, or feel free to drop us a line at offthebooks@workiva.com. Surf's up, and we'll see you on the next wave.